Hello and welcome to my final multimodal composition for English 658 Computers and Composition. For this final multimodal piece, I wanted to talk about how multimodal composition, such as video making like this one, can teach students about different aspects of composition. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on transitions that can be invisible on paper when students are composing textually, but can really stand out when they are composing visually. For the first video, I want to show you this popular beta that's been going around the internet recently, and because I did not transition into it for my previous visual, it might be a little jarring. So now if I had transitioned from the first video to the second clip, you would have kind of known what to expect and you would have been ready for something. But because the other one just kind of ends and then something completely different starts, it's a little jarring visually. This is one thing that I see regularly as being a tutor in the Writing Center, is that I see students get their points together. They read out their paragraphs, but then when we're reading it out loud, it's jumping from point to point, and normally that transition, hopefully that transition is in between the paragraphs where they finish talking about one point and start the next one without really transitioning, leading into it, or anything like that.
Students are encouraged to attempt any form of writing which may help them discover and communicate what they have to say.
When we see it visually, it can really stand out. Students will be able to see, oh, I need something. They'll be able to think and realize I need something to lead my audience from this point to my next point. So whether that can be like a little black screen there in between to signal that one is ending, the next one's beginning, and the next video should have some kind of logical flow to it. So when somebody's watching it, it'll make sense.
Burke, expert logologist and prolific writer, saw not only the text, he saw the components and the process by which it was crafted. A writer sees writing.
So for this next video, if I didn't have another transition again on purpose to show that this next video is a police chase, I can, if I use effective cueing and transitions, I can get the audience to follow my points that I would be making. But this video is purposely not transitioning from one to the next, so you can see how that would be for the audience. They're expecting one thing going along with you, but then this other video, they don't know what to do with it, right? That can be the same thing with a paragraph. From one point to your next, to you it might make sense, to the writer it might make sense, but to the audience, they're having to do a lot of work to figure out what's going on. Why is this video going from here to that one? If you're jumping from point to point, that might not be obvious. Transitions would not stand out so much unless you were reading it, and you might think they make sense, but your audience would be left guessing as to your intentions. So let's take a look at a transition on text. This is an essay I wrote for another class. It's about defining minority rhetorics. It's a rhetoric class I'm writing. So we'll go down here. This is the introduction, and stating, the articles I'm focusing on, my main points, and kind of my thesis is around this area. And so if we read that, let's say, this is significant because to be able to reclaim power, the minorities need to occupy the same rhetorical space and define a place for themselves. So that kind of ends my initial thought, and then the next one begins off of that thought. So Johnson begins her article by explaining how she is defining rhetoric as a cultural site and why this is important. So this sentence right here is working as a transition. It's connecting my point. It's stating some of my points that I'm reintroducing the article I mentioned earlier, And now I'm going into a little bit more in depth where I continue. She states that the boundaries around rhetoric, and this is a quote from her. So I don't just stop talking here and go on to a completely new point. This point is relevant to this one. And by explaining how I'm looking at it and then going into her quote, I'm connecting it to the points I made earlier. Another point, this is also my conclusion. It's a short paper. And so I'm kind of the transition from, by restating here, kind of where I left off here, I'm transitioning and showing that, okay, now I'm going to talk about why this is significant. So that's the transition here. If we were looking at it in a video, it would make sense. I would have some kind of visual transition from here to here. This is where the line breaks would be, and this one is connected to this one. It's harder to see here in paper. I have to do a lot more explaining, connection, pointing to show that I am transitioning these things. Whereas in video, we have visual transitions. We have the dark screen. We have scene cuts to this next scene. Things like that that show where we are or are not transitioning. I did this paper, which I spent a long time making sure that it made sense because of the points I was making sure I was transitioning well from one to the next point to the next point, because I was building up an argument. If I would have just had Johnson and then Enoch and then talked about both of them, it wouldn't flow like this one. I would still be making the same points, but the transitions and maybe the point I'm making might not be so obvious. I had to do a lot of transition and connecting in this paper for my point to come across. Kind of like the beginning here, because the first video is that popular video of the girl walking around, this one. And the next one, which is a police chase, I could put these together in some kind of way as long as it makes sense why I'm putting them together. I'm putting them in here purposely because they do not make sense together. Whether they are thematically similar doesn't really matter. We can put together different ideas in essays and novels and books as long as we're giving the reader an idea of what we're doing. As long as we help them understand the work that we are doing, we can do whatever we want with that work.
Contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Crap.
By having students compose in multimedia formats, multimodal composition, we can have things that seem almost invisible in written textual composition really stand out by videos. Multimodal can help us in this sense to teach students about composition by introducing a new medium, whether it's video, whether it's audio. Students have to reimagine how they would lead from point to point. They can't just throw everything together and have it make sense. It'll stand out a lot more visually and orally than it will on a written paper.
When Murray tells us to teach writing as a process, not product, he speaks specifically to each of us.
There are no rules, no absolutes, just alternatives. What works one time may not another. All writing is experimental.